Hello everyone and welcome to Pyanodons Mods. This is Otaku Showboat and today we're going to be doing an updated video on iron ore processing, and this will be the beginning of a series of updated high suite tutorials. A little while back I had done several tutorials from before Pi Alien Life released, and since the release, as well as all of the other updates to the rest of the Pi suite, things have changed a little bit. My recommendations are now a little bit different for a variety of the ore processing setups, and pretty much every single tutorial I've made up to this point for the Pi suite is in some way, shape, or form a little bit outdated, with very, very few exceptions. So let's get into the iron ore processing. But first, I will remind folks that if they are enjoying these tutorials, or if you would like to continue seeing more of them, please be sure to comment, like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and if you're so inclined, you can head over to twitch.tv/Otaku to leave a follow to watch my streams. I am streaming a Pi block playthrough at the moment with the entirety of the Pi suite. Depending on when you watch this video, I may or may not still be playing that, but I do stream on Twitch, so you can have a look there. You can do all of the social stuff through the links below the video, including supporting Pyanodon's mods development at patreon.com/Pyanodon and myself at patreon.com/Otaku Showboat. That would be the place to go to help to continue producing content such as this. So, in these tutorials, I'm going to assume you have at least some familiarity with a few very specific things in the early game, specifically like how to get coal gas, how to get syngas. Very early stuff, essentially. I'm not going to really explain how to get things like coal gas or syngas in these specific ore processing videos. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the entirety of the ore processing setups as we increase tech levels throughout the game. And we are starting today with our good friend Iron. Glorious, beautiful, wonderful Iron. And unlike last time, I now have Hellmod to help to illustrate these various ore processing setups. And we're going to begin at the very beginning of the game here. So at the beginning of the game, when you start up a new game, you're only going to have access to a very basic recipe in the stone furnace that converts ore into stone at a very, very, very poor ratio. This is going to be your only way of getting iron until you get into red science. Expect this 15 to 1.9 to carry over for a good little while. This is going to force you to mine more early for iron. I would highly suggest at least going into the 30 ore per second pretty quickly, and scaling everything from at least 30. But yeah, so this'll be your ratio of things. Copper is going to be identical to this at the very beginning as well, just as an FYI. The first step, iron and copper, are completely identical. You don't need anything to mine these, it's just put miners down and mine the ore and process in the stone furnace. We no longer have access to a hot air processing of plates from iron ore or from processed iron. So the next thing that we have access to will be at red science when we get access to basic processing of iron into processed iron in jaw crushers. Here we're going to have access to the Mark I versions of both the jaw crusher and the advanced foundry once we pick up coal processing 1, which is needed to get into, of course, all of the advanced ore processing techs as well. So you will have access to the buildings once you are able to actually do this processed iron step. This is where things start to get a little bit more complex, in that while yes, you have this processed iron step, you do have to deal with an output of stone now as well, as a byproduct of this. So at this phase of the game, you have to figure out something for that stone. Now, there are different ways of getting rid of stone itself. You can burn it if you have titanium. So if you have titanium plates for burners with the burner tech, you can burn stone, and that is about the end. You can burn gravel, and you can burn basically any solid thing that doesn't have a fuel value. So be sure to figure out something to do with this stone. You can use it just fine, just you have to deal with it in order for this to continue to move for you. That being said, this is a ratio 15:3 iron plates if you do this, but you might not want to do this because you also, at Red Science, gain access to this process, which is the Molten Iron Casting with hot air. Now, I mentioned that hot air has changed since the last time I made one of these tutorial videos. Not only has hot air changed in how it's used, it's also changed in how it's produced. So hot air now, at the early phases of the game, is going to require you to spend stone bricks for it. You make a regenerative heat exchanger, and you feed it stone bricks with pressured air, and it will make hot air for you. You do not get your stone bricks back anymore at Red Science at the beginning of the game. There is technically a process that is available to you at Green Science that will allow you to loop the stone bricks, but it will cost you a little bit of coal gas at that phase, and then later on you'll be able to progressively heat up your stone bricks to get into hot stone bricks and start looping all of that to get even more hot air, and that's going to cost you a bit of this stuff called outlet gas 4. But that is another video where I have already talked about the changes to hot air. Now, it is absolutely worth it, because if we look at this process of not going into molten at 15 iron ore in per second and compare it to the 15 iron ore in per second by going the route of molten, we increase by 10.5 plates per second. We almost have a yellow belt and almost a 1-to-1 ratio here just by adding the hot air here. This is why every step going forward, I am not going to even pay attention to the recipes that do not use hot air when it involves molten casting. So if you see icons here that have the little hot air icon, every single one of those is going to be a molten casting, because that is how hot air is used now. It improves molten casting in general. There is a key exception in regards to glass, and things may get modified with glass at some point, so we shall see going forward. But just for now, with iron, at Red Science, I would highly recommend going into the molten casting. However, molten casting is going to be rather expensive in terms of material build cost of basic oxygen furnaces as well as casting units. So you're going to have to save up resources to build the buildings needed to do this, and you need to be mining borax. Nothing has changed in regards to borax mining and processing overall, outside of, anything that might have involved hot air. That I don't think anything did. So in general, the borax video that already exists in the tutorial series is still somewhat mostly up to date in regards to its overall process. So if you have borax, this here might actually be the point for you to start mining borax and processing into actual borax. You mine raw borax and then you wash it into borax in washers. As for the oxygen, you have to build electrolyzers to get oxygen. This would be 5 Mark I electrolyzers to get the 108 oxygen, because each one is 25 units of oxygen. And you'll have to figure something out to do with the hydrogen out of that process. Basic oxygen furnaces also do need a fuel, a solid fuel source. So any solid fuel, here it's just listing coke, but any solid fuel will do. And you need sand castings, which means you will need a source of tar for these sand castings, because the sand castings are tar into creosote, and then creosote plus sand into sand castings. So that's the basics in regards to the red science processing. I would say 100% of the time you're going to want to go as fast and hard as you can to get into this, just as quickly as you can. Get here. Once you get red science, get here as fast as you can for the iron plate output. It's going to be different with copper, and you're going to be a little bit starved on copper in the early game because you don't have access to molten this early. There is only currently one other ore that gives you a molten processing availability at red science, and that is aluminium. But we will get to that in a later video. Now, once you get into green science, you will have access to the Unslimed Iron processing, and it is at this point in the game where you now have to start not only thinking of iron plates output, but you also have to start thinking about steel plates output, because it is at the green science phase of the game that you will have access to molten steel processing. And molten steel is going to be made out of molten iron. And at this point in the game, there's also new methods of producing steel and molten super steel and molten stainless steel. There's new processes that help improve all of the outputs of that stuff down the line, but for now, in this particular video, we're not going to be talking about the further processing of steel of iron into steel or super steel or stainless steel. It's actually stainless then super, but whatever. We'll get to that separately in separate videos in a separate video that'll cover all of those extra little processing chains that have been added fairly recently into the Pi suite. But for now, just keep in the back of your mind this idea that you're going to need a lot more iron than it may look like here in terms of molten iron, because even though this gives a fair bit of plates, you're going to need extra molten for those other things going down the line. Now, unslimed iron has been nerfed considerably. In fact, the output has been cut in half from what it used to be, so also keep that in mind, that relatively recently, unslimed iron has been cut in half in terms of its overall output of molten at this step down here, which counteracts the hot air processing into iron plates a bit. It counteracts this. This used to be a bit higher than 24, a fair bit higher than 24. But you can see at unslimed iron, you still get more iron plates out than iron ore in at this phase of processing. So, what is this phase of processing? This phase of processing, we are now going to start screening the processed iron from our previous step. We're going to start screening that processed iron into grade 1, 2, and 3 iron. The grade 3 iron is secondary crushed down to grade 2, then impact crushed, all of the grade 2, the combined total, into grade 1, and a bit of gravel. You'll have to figure out what you want to do with the gravel. As a side note, also with stone, you have the ability to convert stone into saline water, which is also quite useful, but because you can then avoid a burner by uh, pitfalling using a sinkhole on the saline water. Note, however, that sinkholes use steel, so that's another point to consider. Sinkholes use steel, and burners use titanium, so use whichever one you have access to at that point in time. However, if you have jaw crushers, I'm assuming you're going to have the engine units to make the jaw crushers at this point in the game. Anyway, like as early as here, like jaw crushers are engine units, which is at this point aluminium. So, yeah, you have to do a whole bunch of really early game ore processing in the current state of the game. A lot more than just iron, copper, tin, uh, and that's basically it. Glass, iron, copper, tin, glass. It's what it really used to be, but now it's like also aluminium and also lead and titanium and all that good stuff. So, yeah, it's great. It's great. Current state is great. Now, once you have all of that grade 1 in total, the combined total between here will then get powderized in a ball mill into an iron ore dust. This dust will go into a hydroclassifier with water to produce pulp 1 and iron slime. And at this phase of the game, you are going to take both of these and convert them into unslimed iron using more hydroclassifiers and a hydrocyclone. And this will give you a bit of unslimed iron. Add it to borax with oxygen and a solid fuel source in basic oxygen furnaces. You can see how many fewer basic oxygen furnaces you need now for the same ore input, going down the unslimed iron route. And it gives you a bunch more iron. You have nearly doubled your iron plate and molten iron output by going up to unslimed iron. This is still a really good thing to do, and is basically a requirement in every single Pi playthrough that you ever do. You are always, always, always going to go into unslimed iron processing. I will note that in my Paidu Valley series of streams, I never went past the unslimed iron processing. I never had to go past the unslimed iron processing because as we go forward, we have to bear in mind that everything involving ore processing is a trade-off between a process that gives you more plates per ore versus building more, right? As versus mining more ore and processing more ore. So if you are lacking in iron resource deposits, if you've chosen to play a game with smaller resource patches and don't have as much access to iron, if you're playing with biters for some weird reason that I will never be able to comprehend, you're playing with biters and you don't have that much access to patches of iron ore, then you're going to want to definitely go down as efficient of processing as you can, and even go beyond the unslimed iron. This next phase is going to be available to you at Blue Science, and this phase is the high-grade iron processing phase. And in general, for most people, this would be the phase that you stop at if you're going past unslimed iron. This would be where you stop at through the rest of the game, if you make it through the rest of the game, particularly because the next steps unlock at utility science, and if you have utility science, chances are you've already made enough iron, right? Chances are you already have enough iron and you're no longer really thinking about the amount of iron you're producing at that phase of the game. So just keep all of that in mind as we go through here. So everything up to the Unslimed Iron is identical to previously. We now have access to Mark II buildings. Now that we are at Blue Science, we have our Circuit 2s now. So we are going to be thinking about using and upgrading all of our ore processing setups into Mark II now. We are going to, however, keep this same 15 iron ore, which is a yellow belt of ore input, the same here, although at this point we would now also have access to red belts and could use red belts if we so desired. Now, in general, we should have red belts by now through the advanced small parts. It really will vary, I think. So, there is a slight change, though, in that we are no longer going to be converting our iron pulp into unslimed iron. We are instead going to use a jig, which requires circuit 2s, to even make the Mark I jig, to convert the iron pulp into iron concentrate. Note the output of coal water slurry fuel here. Note this output. We can potentially make use of that for other inputs later. Now, we're going to get back to this iron concentrate a little bit further down. What are we going to do with the unslimed iron? The unslimed iron will be converted into iron pulp 2 in a centrifugal pan. However, you now need to add some things besides iron. No longer will we have to only think about adding water into our system. We now need to think about some more things. In this case, petroleum sulfonates, which petroleum sulfonates is apparently an empty list because the game needs to show me hidden. There we go. And disabled. So, petroleum sulfonates, sodium hydroxide, crude oil, sulfuric acid, and saline water. At this phase of the game, you should have all 4 of these by Blue Science, or have the ability to make them by Blue Science. Depending on what type of a game you're playing, if you're playing a normal playthrough or if you're playing a pie block playthrough, that crude oil may or may not be a problem. So keep all of that in mind. The saline may or may not be a problem, depending on what style of game you're playing. But yeah, it's just going to be sodium hydroxide, crude oil, sulfuric acid, and saline water. Note that that recipe does 400 per cycle, every 3 seconds cycle. So it's really not going to be all that bad when you're processing a yellow belt and only need 4.6 units per second of the petroleum sulfonates. It's basically a check of, do you have these 4 things to continue with this processing. Similarly, with oleochemicals, this is a question of, do you have nichrome and lard? Or do you have lard and titanium? I generally would not suggest doing the lard and titanium, just because lard is pretty expensive, and this uses a lot of lard. In the context of Pi Alien Life, lard is a bit expensive at Blue Science, / it is a very big setup to produce lard. It's a lot of space used to produce lard, particularly in Pi Alien Life now, so keep that in mind. There are other methods here. Skin and alien bacteria. Don't add things that use alien bacteria when you don't have to. Trust me on this. Alien bacteria is one of the most painful things in a Pi Alien Life playthrough to produce going into the late game. If you have a consistent source of refined syngas, this might be useful to you, but that is a very bad ratio. Going from 150 down to 60 in the oleochems, I would never really say that this sporopollenin recipe is particularly useful. There is another recipe that uses sporopollenin for biofilm. Biofilm? No, biopolymer. That is a much better use of sporopollenin in the end. So my suggestion is nichrome, lard, water. You will have to deal with the glycerol in some way on the oleochemicals. Note that you will need more than 4.6 oleochemicals because it is going to be used in some other stuff down the line. So that's our pulp 2. We then have to take our pulp 2 in a leaching station to make pulp 3. This will require Xylenol. Now, Xylenol will differ in which recipe that you use for it as you go up the tech levels of iron processing. You'll get different recipes for Xylenol as you increase your iron processing level, so you will not have access to all of these recipes at this phase of the game. Now, as for what I would recommend, well, you're pretty much, I think, stuck with the tar at the beginning. The tar is the simplest method of getting Xylenol, to say the least. It really does depend on how much tar you have access to throw at this. Tar is an infinite resource, no matter what style of gameplay you're playing in. Whether you're playing on a standard map with tar nodes, or if you're playing on a pie block map, or the tar is infinite, so just you can do this just fine. Otherwise, benzene aromatics is tempting if you do have a consistent source of both of those through advanced oil processing, I would say. But really, the one to think about and consider the most would be the titanium tetrachloride and low distillates. When you get access to titanium tetrachloride low distillates, that would be the one to use. The 1-to-1 ratio is the most appealing here, even though it does use a catalyst. I compared to the last time I did these tutorials, I am a lot more, how should I say this? I am more willing to use these types of recipes that use titanium tetrachloride and other like catalyst type recipes, quote unquote catalyst, because it doesn't return the thing, right? So spending things like the titanium tetrachloride, the tin chromium alloy, the nichrome, all of that, I am more okay with using those things. So just bear in mind several ways of getting Xylenol. The pulp 3 has to be floated in a flotation cell with organic solvent. Now, organic solvent's one of those basic things you definitely have by now, but again, just to reiterate, with organic solvent, the way in which I'm sure a lot of people are going to be working towards doing organic solvent is going to be the acetone syngas process, which acetone, there's a phenol recipe that produces acetone. Definitely go down that route. It's from cumene processing, and you can do that without having to do the phosphoric acid stuff. So just keep that in mind. This acetone syngas is one of the best outputs of organic solvent, and it gives you ammonia. Which is also fantastic. So that will be the pulp 4. Don't forget the pressured air in here. The pulp 4 will go into pulp 5, just adding pressured air and water. It's pretty simple. The 5 will go into 6 and 2. That will loop back, and this is why we have our matrix solver on. So then we add more 2, which means more 3, 4, 5, and 6 in the end by looping this back. Keep in mind that you'll have to make sure you have some sort of an overflow system here, because the last thing you need is for the pipes to get full of iron pulp 2 and not be able to output any more pulp 6 because your pipe on pulp 2 is full. Alright, so here you're going to need some sulfuric acid. Lots of ways of getting sulfuric acid, lots of very viable ways of getting sulfuric acid. I like the vanilla way of getting sulfuric acid if you have a consistent source of sulfur. There are many consistent sources of sulfur. I like it in particular because it is, as a vanilla recipe, capable of having productivity modules assigned to it, but that is a consideration for later in the game than what you're at now. Right now you only really have access to level 1 modules. If you're using Bob's modules, you're not even at modules yet. So just keep that in mind. You can do acid gas into sulfuric acid as a cadaveric orm processing thing to get your acid gas. Or you could do the better acid gas into sulfuric acid through cadaveric aurum acid gas by using this chromium petroleum acid gas setup that actually gives aromatics. Although, note in that aromatics, you can use the aromatics output from this to produce the petroleum gas in this system. So there is a recipe that uses tin chromium alloy to convert aromatics and hydrogen into petroleum gas. And it actually produces enough petroleum gas to keep this system going, and actually overproduces on the aromatics ever so slightly. Ever so slightly. So it ends up being a closed system with a slight overproduction of aromatics to keep the process going, and it just converts acid gas into sulfuric acid at a really good ratio at the cost of chromium and tin chromium alloy. And if you want to see that in action, you can watch my Haidu Valley series where I do this out of cadaveric aurum acid gas. But later on, once I do get access to much better productivity modules, I do switch over to doing vanilla processing. So bear that in mind. There's also the option of getting it out of Xeno blood. Xenos are too expensive and come way too late in the game to be of any value for getting sulfuric acid for you. You will have already answered the sulfuric acid problem by then. You will already have solved the problem of sulfuric acid by the point in the game where this would even remotely become relevant, and even then it's still probably not going to be the best solution for you. But it's all up to you whether or not you want to do things in this way. Moving on. So that will give you pulp 6. We're going to get back to the pulp 6 shortly. What about that iron concentrate from all the way up here? That iron concentrate is going to be continued to be powdered in a ball mill, and it's going to give you a little bit of iron ore dust that loops all the way back up to here. All the way back up to here. That little bit of iron ore dust is going to go all the way back up here, and it's going to increase again how much stuff you get in the whole process up to now. It's also going to give you fine iron concentrate. You then have to add, in a flotation cell, Armac 12D. Armac is lead, oleochemicals, and ammonia. Hey. Ammonia. Just gonna point that out there. Now, ammonia, realistically speaking, in order to actually produce it on a larger scale, you're going to want to do the process that converts nitrogen and hydrogen into ammonia at the cost of chromium as a catalyst. That is going to be your primary ammonia overall at this point, more likely than not. There are other processes. I want to make sure that I appease Pyanodon by not saying things particularly authoritatively, like do this way type things. He really does not like that. Options are there for a reason. They're options. Do them when they are best suited for your current conditions on whatever map you're playing. I'm just going to say, in general, you're probably going to want to do the nitrogen-hydrogen processing for ammonia as a consistent source of ammonia. Just in general for your whole base. Now, this Armac 12D, I think, is also pretty specific to ore processing, so keep that in mind as well. Now, the Pulp 6, of course, is going to go into additional Pulp 7, dealing with tailings all along the way. By the way, I haven't mentioned the tailings, but yes, there are processes that do end up giving you tailings that you'll have to deal with as byproducts. All that Pulp 7 will be filtered into high grade using filtration media, which you should have by now. And then, just as before, we then convert our high grade with borax and oxygen and a solid fuel source into more molten still, and then into additional plates, keeping in mind our hot air as we go along through all of this process. Note how much less borax is used as we have been going on down the line, comparing from back here with our 6 borax into 3.4 and now into about 3.7, so it's it's not as bad as at the very beginning. It's a little bit more than the previous step, but still within reason. And also, scaling with however much or input you have at this point. Um, so yeah. The next two steps that I get into are going to be reduction and sintering, and they are going to be available to you at Yellow Science. Utility Science. We'll start by having a look at reduction and then looking at sintering so that you can compare the two with each other. I am not going to look at the sintering of high grade into sintered just because that is never going to be a thing that you do with iron. I don't know why that particular recipe exists, but it is just one of those few times I will say objectively it's not going to be viable ever. You will always reduce your high grade and then sinter the reduced for iron. For iron. Just that clarification. For iron, you are never going to do high grade sintered directly. It is I don't know why it exists. It's a trap. It's a trap. Don't do it. Don't do it. Now, this is also a trap because you get access to both reduction and sintering. There are very few remote circumstances where you might want to do reduced into molten. But just so we're clear, when you do reduction, it has to be done in a direct reduction plant, which I think requires circuit 3s. It will take your high-grade iron, and you have to add sodium sulfate, which you should have by this point in the game, as well as diesel, which you also should have by this point in the game, but just so that we're aware, diesel has this nice aromatics hydrogen chromium recipe to produce diesel, similarly to petroleum gas. It's much heavier on the aromatics than the petroleum gas recipe, but it's a use for the light oil refinery, and Pyanodon really likes when people actually use light oil refinery, so that's why I'm gonna like say to really consider doing this one for diesel, because the naphtha is not generally something a lot of people really use. I don't particularly use naphtha all that much. You can do arcods though at this point, just in the realm of Pi Alien Life. Arcods exist, so you should probably think about using them. Although this particular one converts methanol into a whole bunch of diesel, so you will still need methanol. These recipes are the same, just because there's one is an upgraded recipe from the other that you get via a tech upgrade, which is pretty common in Pi Alien Life. There's also the option of doing enriched moondrop recipe that will give you diesel out of a cobalt enriched moondrop. You add a phytomining cobalt thing into moondrops to make a cobalt enriched moondrop flour, and that'll give you some diesel. That is a whole mechanic I haven't really looked at a lot, so expect me to look at that and have some sort of a tutorial regarding just phytomining and dealing with this moondrop enriched stuff at some point down the line. And then there's also, of course, the Nextlit olefins, which, if you have olefins, I don't like spending Nextlit because it's a pain to get Nextlit, but hey, these also exist as well. In fact, in my Paidu Valley series, just a note on olefins, I never made olefins in my Paidu Valley series, and I got 1 science per second on all sciences, including military and space. Like, I got 1 science per second of space science and all of the other sciences without olefins in that base. So yeah, just keep things in mind. Some things are completely optional for you. So note that this makes 98.3 from a 15 ore input of the molten. Eventually able to make 73.7, but not like that particularly matters, because at this point, again, you're focusing way more on the amount of steel, stainless steel, and super steel that you're going to get out of this molten iron. The sintering process, and I'm chosen the sintering process from note Mark 3s here, Mark 4s here, because you will have one or the other, generally speaking, not really both. You will either still be at Mark 3 when you're thinking about doing the sintering process, or you're at Mark 4 and thinking about doing the sintering process. Why either one? Well, it's because when you get to utility science, when you first get to utility science and you're starting to take those utility techs, you're going to be at Mark 3. To get to Mark 4 will require making all of the things that you need to make to get space science. So really, Mark 4 is more of a space science thing and a thing that you're thinking about doing in order to reduce entity counts for higher level production goals in a mega base type of a setup. And by mega base, that would be anything from 1 science per second and up. I'm not joking. 1 per second and up would be considered for pi to be a mega base type of a setup. And in fact, some would argue that just completing the pi suite requires mega base scale of stuff. So just note that only think about Mark IV if you have a specific production target for science. That's the primary thing here when thinking about Mark IVs. Otherwise, Mark III will be sufficient to you. Also, just default module slots. Just a note on default module slots. 1 at Mark I, 2 at Mark II, 3 at Mark III, 4 at Mark IV. Those are the default module slot settings. You can use mods to double that at each progressive level. So you can go 1 to 2 to 4 to 8. That's my personal module slot counts that I like using for the Pi Suite buildings, because I like modules. Unlike Pyanodon, I like modules, all modules, including productivity. And if you get to Mark III, and if you get to Mark IV, you deserve more module slots than just 3 or 4, right? You really need... You could really make good use of the UPS savings at that phase of the game by having the double that, having the 6 and the 8. So anyway, that's my little side tangent on the module slot side of things. Going into sintering from reduction, it's just one extra step. You just sinter reduced by adding lime, which is very easy to make, syngas, which is very easy to make, and pressured air and a solid fuel. It is lime, syngas, and a solid fuel with pressured air. Like, it is... You will never have a circumstance where you want to not do sintering, but do reduced for iron. You will always sinter iron. So in essence, this whole production chain doesn't need to exist here, because you are never going to do this. This is purely for illustrative measures. You're not going to do this. You're always going to do this, perhaps as Mark IIIs. It doesn't matter with the derps or the sinter plants. Yes, the direct reduction plants, the DRPs, they are derps. These are derps. And when you can do derps, do derps. And when you can do sintering, do sintering. Very, very few, in fact, one ore type, you will have sintering. You will have reduction before sintering. Only one, and that is chromium. Chromium, you will do reduction before you do sintering. Potentially. So just bear that in mind. For iron, you will always sinter, and never sinter high grade. Like, why would you skip this and get half the output? Because here it's 2 sintered per 1 reduced, and it's 1 high grade into 1 reduced, so it's 1 into 2. 1 high grade to 2 sintered. If you skip this step, it's 1 high grade to 1 sintered. So it would halve the output. Anyway, that makes a whole bunch more iron still. It is 98.3 for reduction alone, and then 147.4 for sintering. So there you go. Sintering of a yellow belt of iron, making 147.4 molten, which, if completely converted into iron plates, would be 110.6 iron plates per second. Just for reference, it says there that's 7.4 yellow belts worth of stuff. And you can half that number for red belts. And at this point, you have blue belts or higher, depending on if you're using a mod that adds better belts overall. So that, my friends, is the iron processing chain as presented in Hellmod. We can have a look at it here on an actual editor extensions map. Just having a look at, here's our jaw crushers on step 1, our automated screeners, the secondary crusher, impact crusher, ball mills, the hydro classifiers, just in general. If you really want to see what all of this looks like in action, I still have the outdated videos, tutorial videos, on my channel. You can go and look at those more outdated videos if you have not already, to actually see a build of going all the way through sintering for all of the various ore processing setups. Just note that the information presented in those videos is now somewhat outdated, and my thoughts and opinions on how to get a number of the side inputs have changed since then, particularly in light of the release of Pi Alien Life and a number of updates to the Pi suite that have happened since then. So here's all of the high grade stuff. Here's all of the high grade stuff. Here's all of the unslimed iron stuff, with the key here being that we have the hydrocyclone for unslimed from pulp 1 versus the pulp 1 going into that concentrate once we get into the high grade processing. This is all unslimed, and then this is the processed iron at Red Science initial processing, plus the BOFs and the casting at the very end. Then we have reduction and sintering, which are very simple processes. Ultimately, they are very simple processes. And then of course, the processing of the molten into the stuffs. Just again, reiterating, there's also, you have to think about the molten steel and the molten stainless steel and the molten super steel that'll use progressively more and more and more and more and more of your molten iron. But later on in the Pi suite, there's actually not as much of a demand on straight up iron anymore. The scaling of iron use is not that big, so there is room to make the steel, make the stainless steel, make the super steel. In fact, steel isn't going to have much of a big use either, so you can actually keep your steel rather low in its output, as well as your iron, relatively speaking, somewhat low, depending on what you're doing and what you're using iron for. Of course, you're going to need more if you're doing the vanilla sulfuric acid processing that uses iron plates, but still. The point is, you're going to need more stainless steel for advanced small parts, and in particular advanced small parts, but also, circuit 2s, the buildings to make circuit 2s. There is a very specific set of buildings that will require stainless steel, and you need stainless steel for the blue science in and of itself. So there's science using stainless steel, and then super steel has similar things. It's going to be needed for your special small parts. So, all that said, I would like to thank you all for watching. After this 50-minute review of the iron processing chain, a lot of it being in Hellmod. If you have enjoyed this video, please be sure to comment, like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and give my Twitch a visit, twitch.tv/Otaku if you would like to watch my streaming of the Pi Suite. I have, in Hellmod, the production line code string, the production line string, is available through my Discord in the string sharing channel for Factorio, where we're sharing blueprints and all of that other stuff. Hellmod, if in case you didn't know, Hellmod does allow you to share strings of production lines, so you can get this production line showing all of the steps involved in producing iron through my Discord. The link is in the description below the video to get to my own public Discord. So just keep that in mind. And as we go forward with additional ore processing videos, you can expect that those Hellmod setups, production lines, will also get posted onto my Discord server in that same channel. So you can look forward to that. How would you use this? Well, what you would do is you would go into a production block. Say we want to look at the high grade, for example. The high grade production block, what we would do is we would come in here, we would set it to ingredient input, or at least make sure we are set to ingredient input. That is one thing that is not saved in the string. So all of these will be set to product input. Set it to ingredient input so you can tell it how much iron that you're producing, that you want to plan for. What you're going to do is you're going to copy this production block and paste it into a new production line. This way, again, ingredient input 15 ore per second. In this way, what we can do is we can go and make additional production blocks for the outside inputs. So for the petroleum sulfonates, for the oleochems, for the Xylenol, for the Armac 12D, etc. So that lets you do that for the outside inputs in separate blocks. If you try to do that in the separate blocks here, it will attempt to give you the total amount of Armac 12D that is listed here. It'll try to give you 63.2 because it wants to default to a linked block that is linked to everything. So make sure that you either unlink the various things, or you have to make sure that you go into here. So either delete everything else or paste it in a new block. Just one of those, by the way, is how you would use Hellmod for this setup. And so again, thank you all for watching. Be sure to engage with the video, and I will be back next time with the copper processing video. At least I am hoping it's the copper processing video. I will see you all then.